Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, An Economist Goes Shopping, Black Friday, Holidays, and the Current Economy. I'm Greg Berry, Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Since this is a virtual event, please excuse technical issues that may pop up. And if you have a problem with your audio or video, click the reconnect button on your screen to get back to the webinar right away. Today's webinar is being recorded. We plan to have a replay available on our website by tomorrow. Also, have a question for our guests, drop it in the chat. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. Benjamin Meadows to our webinar series. Dr. Meadows is an assistant professor of economics at UAB. He earned his Master's of Arts in Economics in 2016 and was awarded his PhD in Economics in 2020, both from Tennessee. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Meadows for today's presentation. I'm looking forward to this. We've had this on the books for quite a few months. And now the platform is yours.
Thanks so much. Hey, everybody. I hope everyone's doing okay. I'm coming at you live from Atlanta. I'm actually here in a large conference of economists. So these are things probably we're talking about over the water cooler, so you can kind of get the inside gossip of kind of what economists are thinking about over the next year. So when Gregory originally proposed this idea about what does it look like in the modern times to think about holiday shopping and inflation and what economics has to say about it, I immediately paused and thought that, well, probably where we need to start is where all of this began. And so what I want to talk about first is thinking about how did we get here that we have to worry about inflation and holiday shopping at the same time? And then, of course, what do we do about it? Now, I want to give you all a little bit of a pre-warning. What we do about it may be super underwhelming, but to understand why that's the case, we have to understand the economics behind it and where we've come from all this. So let's start about how we got here, and it's sadly enough bad news, COVID. Okay, so how did we get to the point that we're in where we have to worry about inflation? Well, you need to go all the way back to the start, and we need to talk about 2020. So COVID-19 presented a crisis to the U.S. economy that we had not seen in a long time, if ever, right? You'd have to go back to the context of the Spanish flu to figure out how an economy should adjust when there's a worldwide pandemic occurring all at the same time. And then we have a very, very different economy now than when the Spanish flu rolled out. So in the face of crisis, and I do want to show you the crisis, okay? Let's be clear about the crisis. So here's the unemployment rate for the United States plotted from 1940 all the way till right now in 2023. You'll notice that ice pick looking spike in 2020 where where unemployment nearly hits 15%. Yeah, that's a couple months after COVID-19 starts rolling through the U.S. economy. So my point here is that COVID presented, and I know this word's gotten boringified in the real world, but COVID presented an unprecedented level of chaos to the U.S. economy. Policymakers, administrators, the executive branch, everyone was really worried about it for rightfully so. So let's look just in one small sector of the economy, hospitality and leisure. That's where we saw an unemployment rate of close to 40%, which is just absolutely astounding, right? So when you think about COVID-19 rolling through the U.S. economy, there's not a way we can put enough emphasis on the concerns about what was going on. And so what happened in response is that the Federal Reserve took a very activist position. And what I mean is they said they were going to throw everything at the U.S. economy to try to make sure it didn't go under. Some commentators in the finance and economics realm said that Jerome Powell, who is the Fed chair, pointed a bazooka full of money at the U.S. economy and wasn't going to let it fail. Okay. And so when we say that, like literally, he was thinking about everything at his disposal to prop up the U.S. economy. So here's an article from March 16th, 2020. Okay. And I love the tagline here. In one of the boldest moves of its 106-year history, the Federal Reserve, and then, yes, does all these things. Okay. Again, it's because we were facing one of the craziest crises in economics we've ever seen. Now, I want to be clear, and I'll come back to that slide in a second. Why did the Fed take such an activist position in the face of COVID? Well, we need to think about the decisions they had at their disposal. One choice would be they could do nothing and let the economy go under. Like, do nothing, and the economy, right, you just saw the unemployment rate in hospitality was at 40%. The unemployment rate across America was close to 15%. So we could just say, hey, sorry businesses, sorry you don't know how to deal with a global pandemic, deal with it. But there's this question in the aftermath of that, as you know, one layoff spirals another layoff, inspires another layoff, inspires another layoff. How do you rebuild that once all that damage is finally settled? Like, we don't, as economists, we don't have a textbook on how to rebuild an entire economy after a pandemic has wrecked it. The other choice we had was to do a massive monetary expansion. So the idea is, like, we're going to take that bazooka and point it at the American economy and push all this money there, knowing that there's going to be a side effect. There's going to be inflation at some point. But here's the thing that policymakers, and mainly the Federal Reserve, figured out, is that we know how to deal with the side effects. If we have inflation, we know we will need to raise rates, and we'll need to do a couple of other policies to try to get inflation under control. We know that'll happen, but at least we know how to deal with it. And so this is less uncertainty. This is a known commodity. We do a massive monetary expansion, try to prop up the American economy, and then we know one day we're going to have to deal with inflation. And so that's what the Fed chose to do. And this is pretty alarming. I know this looks like kind of a nerdy graph. It is. But M2 is measuring basically the total amount of money that's circulating in the U.S. economy. And what you'll notice is where I've pointed that arrow, that huge jump, right? Again, look from 1970 all the way to 2020. It's kind of just a smooth growth curve. And there's this huge jump in 2020 to 2021. This is the activist approach that the Fed took. Now, this was a bunch of things. This was normal Fed operations to try to get money flowing in the economy, but it also included things like STEMIs, which was a partnership between the fiscal and monetary branches of our system here. It's important to note that STEMIs were cut under President Trump and they were cut under President Biden. So these were both policies that were enacted by both parties that ended up leading to inflation. And so that's where we end up now, is that we are now in what we would call an inflationary time period. So with another nerd graph, I'm probably graphing y'all to death today, but I think it's important that we're looking at the facts here, is that for the past close to 40 years, we have had a peace and pleasant time of zero inflation. Basically, get out of the 1980s, and we have had very stable inflation rates in the United States. In 2020, notice that the right side of the graph, that all changes. Inflation goes from bouncing along the bottom to spiking. Now, this is the annual inflation number. If I go ahead and move towards a more monthly estimate of the change in the consumer price index, which is mirroring inflation, you'll see, again, this nice, peaceful, not a lot of inflation going on in the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and then boom, in 2020, inflation spikes. Okay, now if we go all the way back, we knew this was coming. Basically, the Federal Reserve had two bad choices. Do we want to prop up the U.S. economy and get inflation for it, or do nothing and watch the American economy shrivel and suffer? And we chose the more disciplined choice, but it also requires maintenance. And so if you look at what is inflation doing, well, inflation is the rise of all prices in the economy. Now, let's just pick a very well-known point. Here's milk prices in the U.S. You'll notice that it looks really messy on my screen. That's because I've erased getting the price of milk inflation adjusted, because I want you to see that in 2019, it looks like milk prices are going down in the United States, and then boom, they pop up and they keep going and going and going until where we are, last year in 2022. This is an important point about inflation. So inflation is the overall rise in price levels in the economy. So inflation is tracking the rise in prices. What's important to realize is that if inflation stops, right? If inflation stops pushing prices up, that means that prices are now level. And this is really important for U.S. consumers. This means that prices aren't going down. It means that they're leveling. And so as the Fed has taken measures to get inflation under control, and we'll talk about that in a second, this means that prices aren't going to go up and then come back down. That's not how inflation works. Inflation is prices go up, and if we get it under control, they come to cruising altitude and stay there. Now, what we'd be worried about is if they come up and then keep going up. That means inflation's still rolling forward. But we actually don't want a world where there's disinflation, where prices are going down. And I can explain that more, but I don't want to kind of get too off topic. So, now what? Well, we are in a weird position in the U.S. economy. And some of you are like, okay, what does this have to do with shopping? I promise I'm getting there. In the U.S. economy, we have seen that from the Fed raising rates, taking other activist positions to try to get inflation under control, it seems to be working, which is a small reason to celebrate. So I'd like to point the graph that's in the top right corner. Core CPI is our best measure of inflation. And you'll notice that orange line that tracks the 3-month change in inflation. It looks like over time, inflation's going down. That's great. Great news. Inflation over the past 2 years has been a really big issue. It's been the highest it's been in a long time. So it's good to see that it's finally seeming to settle down. If we look at core CPI inflation, so this is the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, core inflation minus shelter. So we want to take away all the weird things that are happening in the housing market and just look at everything else that's going on in the economy. We see, again, there's this nice slow trend of inflation finally slowing down. But as economists, we are going to take a big pause because if you look really closely on both graphs at the last time period, the last 2 months, we've seen an uptick. It looks like perhaps inflation may be ticking up. And that's because that's because maybe we haven't fully reined in all the inflationary effects we're seeing in the economy. For one, when we try to get inflation under control, we're raising rates. And so that should slow down a lot of business activities. But if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see this is real GDP. So it's an inflation adjusted, and it grew last quarter. That's kind of weird. We were trying to slow down, right, a lot of business decisions with these rate rises, and the U.S. economy grew, and it grew at a pretty large clip. So this means that it's quite possible that the Fed needs to do more to slow down inflation more. Now, that's not great if your holiday shopping is thinking about buying a house. Well, this is not good news. If you're thinking about just standard goods inflation, it is good that the Fed is taking kind of an active position at trying to get inflation under control. But where this kind of comes in to think about your holiday shopping, which is I know why we're kind of here, is the best we can do in econ is look at the latest releases of measurement of inflation in the U.S. economy. Now, this is where the Bureau of Labor Statistics come in. They're very, very helpful because every month they release the most recent data on the prices that consumers in the U.S. face. Now, I'm going to try to do all the hard work for you, but we're actually going to look at a report together because I think the data is interesting, but I'm a nerdy economist, so I don't know. Y'all can hang with me. I hope it's fun. But basically what happens when the BLS releases these reports, they do a lot of aggregating. So they'll tell you, overall inflation or overall inflation in groceries or overall inflation and used cars. But I think it's going to be, for the shopping context, like let's drill in and look at some popular Christmas items. So we're going to drill in. Now, I need to put one little pin in this. There is a big lag here. So you'll notice at the bottom of the screen, you'll be like, hey, Dr. Meadows, it says September 2023. Why aren't we looking at December 2023? Well, we can only look at data that's already happened, and there is a month-long lag to get the data. So we won't get October's report for another week or so. And so, yeah, sadly enough, this data is a little old, but we can drill in and hopefully learn a couple of things. So let's dive in. And this is where I'm talking about, like, how do Black Friday and shopping and inflation all come to a head? It's right here. So I know some of y'all probably just jump back because that's a very ugly chart. But I promise this is going to be our best attempt to understand how inflation is affecting Christmas shopping. So if we want to think about a large portion of Christmas shopping being for apparel, right, for either men or women's clothing or even footwear, and I've included jewelry as well, we want to know what is the year-on-year inflation rate for these goods. Now, if you haven't gone shopping since 2019, I can't help you. I'm only going to be able to compare year to year. So this is literally comparing September 2022 to September 2023. And what we see is that if you look at the very top of your screen, see if I can annotate this. No, I won't do that. Okay. If you look at the very top of your screen, we have seen apparel inflation. So the growth in overall prices for apparel at 2.3%. Now, some of you are like, is that good or bad? And as an economist, I'm not an ethicist. I don't get to say good or bad. I get to say what is closer to typical. So the Federal Reserve actually targets a 2% inflation rate. And we can talk about why that's important later. But that means that in overall apparel, we're seeing inflation rates that are close-ish to normal. Now, if you look down one line, you'll see that men's and boys apparel, inflation rate of 5%. That's not normal. We don't like that, okay? That means the overall pricing in menswear has gone up by 5%, which is not really what we want to see. We would love to see all of these look like 2%. But you do see that for men's suits, so if you were thinking about buying a suit for a Christmas present, we actually see disinflation. Those prices have gone down overall by 5%. So hooray, there's a little bit of a win there. Now, if we skip on down to women and girls apparel, we see actually some great news, right? Inflation of 1.8%. Why is this great news? Well, because that's below the Fed's target for inflation. So this is actually a better deal than normal, right? It's a better growth in price than normal because it's smaller. Now, if we drill in, you see, women's dresses, 1%. Great. Women's outerwear, 7.4%. Ooh, not great, right? Girls apparel, negative 8%. Negative 0.8. That's great. It's negative, right? So we see a lot of variation here, which is actually very typical in these inflation reports. Now, if you go on down to footwear, even better, right? We see headline inflation for all of those is 0.6. And then within them, you got some negative rates, and then you got 2%. So that's, again, good news there. Okay. Scrolling all the way down to jewelry. Jewelry is at 0.8%, which again, I would take is mildly good news, right? Mildly good news that we're not seeing a lot of inflation there. Drilling into one more spreadsheet, I promise this is it. Just looking at like recreational commodities. So maybe it's like more tech gifts that you're looking for at Christmas. What does inflation look like here? And what's really, really cool is that you see a ton of disinflation here. Now, if you have not been living under a rock, and thankfully my wife and I's TV has hung on for about 10 years, but you've probably noticed this. So I remember, my wife and I, 10 years ago, we were both teachers. Our TV went out. We saved a little bit of money, and we took $300 and went to Best Buy and bought a open box TV because that's the best way to get a deal on it. So we go and get it, and we're very proud of it. And then now I'm walking around Walmart, and I see an 80-inch 4K screen for $300. And I'm like, how in the heck is this possible? Well, there's been a lot of efficiency gains in this space. And so when we think about that and we take the average of, again, if we compared my old TV to this and tried to buy it again, we know over 10 years that price has obviously dropped. It's bigger and better is still at the same price point of my old TV. So that's where some of this disinflation, you're seeing a drop of 10%. What are you talking about? Well, this could be one of the things we've seen is kind of reshoring of a lot of American manufacturing, or what people call nearshoring, where we are getting partners in Mexico and Colombia to produce goods that were once made in China. So they're cheaper to ship and cheaper to produce, which is kind of great. And so you see that in the television market. So when you kind of wind all this up, right, there's some wins, there's some losses. But overall, when we actually think about shopping in the economy with inflation, it all kind of comes back to just knowing your market, knowing what you're shopping for, and kind of knowing what your price point is. But the thing that I want to emphasize here is that when you think about inflation, it's not, unless we're talking about TVs, typically we're going to just see a stabilization in prices, not really a decrease in prices. So quick recap, inflation is here for a reason. It is a side effect of how we fought the economic effects of COVID-19. Sadly enough, that means that prices are here to stay, even if inflation is starting to cool. And now as U.S. consumers, that just means we have to optimize accordingly. Now that we know these are where the new prices are, we kind of have to just adjust our buying decisions accordingly. So I don't know if that was too fast, too slow. I have no idea because I can only see Greg. So I take his smile as a good sign. But I'm happy to take any and all questions because you can tell I don't love econ at all. Like, this is not my life or anything. So I'm happy to take any questions.
And I will say, when I set everything up even right before this, Dr. Meadows just has this great passion for economics. So it's fantastic to see that. And it's a topic that, most people they don't understand. So you put it in layman's terms, you help a lot. And we are going to get some questions coming through here. Keep those questions coming through the chat. We got plenty of time. So I'm going to kick things off. Over the course of one's lifetime, how many periods of inflation, call it major inflation, will you see?
Are you asking me to open the crystal ball? I'm an economist, not a conjurer. So right now, right, if you have lived over the past 50 years, you've seen two really big bouts of inflation, the 1970s and 80s, and now currently. I think it's one of the biggest issues we've had on people responding to the current level of inflation is that for 30, 40 years, it hasn't been an issue. It's not something that we talk about. Where in the 70s and 80s, it was very normal to go approach an employer and say, hey, I need a cost of living adjustment. And they were like, okay, yeah, I see what you're coming from. If you do that in today's world, like, the private industry doesn't know how to respond. They're like, well, you're not doing more work. And it's like, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking that my cost of living has gone up and I need a wage adjustment to account for that. And employers are just caught flat-footed and they're like, no, we only pay more for more work. And there's a tension there between employees and their employers because, for all of us, right, we've seen at the grocery store, if you add up inflation, these costs are two-figure costs, right? I'm thinking from just my personal grocery budget, it's enormous compared to what it was a couple of years ago. And just fully confessing, I'm not going to go to my boss and ask for a raise right now because that's just not how we've normalized American business, right? But we have to. So, the word that we use is COLA, C-O-L-A, cost of living adjustment. And that's going to have to be normalized in the American economy. So, some people are asking, what can we do about it? That's the only thing you can do. And it's really hard when you're on fixed income or things like that because inflation has literally made it harder to live.
So America obviously is going through this inflationary period. What kind of impact does that have on the global economy? I mean, surely it has to because we're a major force, right?
So, I mean, yeah, there's a two-handed argument, as economists always say, on the one hand and on the other hand. So on the one hand, everyone saw bouts of inflation. And it's like the U.S., I think at first saw a little bit worse because we were more activist, but we also got out of the COVID recession quicker. And now it seems like we've stabilized inflation a little quicker. So there's a great graphic. I don't have it handy, but if you look it up online, if you plot the G7 countries and their inflation rates, it's fascinating because they all have kind of mirrored one another. So to your point, Greg, there is some synergy there where you see this kind of same pattern across global markets. It's impossible from an economist's point of view, looking for the causal, what caused what, impossible to tease out because we don't have a U.S. that doesn't have inflation versus a U.S. that does. We don't have a control and treatment U.S. We just have the U.S. And so it's kind of hard to compare that to, to know who was the prime mover between us and the U.K. and Italy and, so on and so forth.
Are there countries that have more of an impact like the U.S.? You mentioned UK and Italy, but are there other ones that really can have an impact even on American economy if something goes south for them?
It's usually the reverse relationship. So this has less to do with inflation, just more about trade. Sure. The line I've always loved to hear from folks in Central America or South America, if the U.S. economy catches a cold, we catch the flu. Just because those effects are way more poignant for the countries that are exporting to us. But yeah, if you have, we saw this right during the COVID recession, the supply chain issues coming from Asia to the United States. Yeah. When there were supply chain crimps, it absolutely affected our economy. Now, I'm very careful to point out that the crimps we saw on the supply chain doesn't look like the predominant force in causing inflation. The predominant force looks like it's monetary. Because otherwise we would have seen stabilization with inflation once those export queues had finally cleared.
What are some other tools besides raising interest rates that can help combat inflation?
Yeah, so one of the things that the Fed has done is trying to, they call it trimming the balance sheet. I call it in class reducing the money supply. So basically, when you think about inflation, what it is you've got the same amount of stuff in the economy, and you've got way more dollars waving around in the air. So, I mean, again, if you think of like a 1980 stock market where people are waving tickets around, think about that with dollars. And if you have twice as many dollars in the same amount of stuff, those dollars aren't as valuable anymore. And so what we've seen on our end is like, that's kind of the predominant charge there.
And if people do have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. So somebody asked, do you think we'll have a recession soon?
I think it's really hard to say. I'm really hesitant to make that prediction because basically it seems like a lot of folks on Wall Street and in big tech have been wishing for one for years. And I don't understand this. There's sure a little bit of creative friction that comes from recessions, but wishing for them seems like to me something that's deeply un-American and deeply perverse for an economy. So I always, when I hear that question, I sometimes hear people's voice like they're wishing for a recession. And I just want to point out that recessions can be deeply destructive for people's livelihoods and things like that. So I hate to go a little strong on it, but I think we need to remember the damage that came from the 2008 recession, and we shouldn't be wishing for that in any case. Now, the other problem I have is that if enough people start panicking and tightening their checking accounts and tightening their wallets, that can spark, demand side, recessionary pressures. So that's the other thing too. I don't want to be like the person who's going to go out and be doom and gloom about it and say, yeah, a recession's on the way, because you can basically have a self-fulfilling prophecy to an extent. And I think that's actually, I would really caution business leaders from doing this behavior, because if enough people do that behavior, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it comes all the way back to my point that these are not good things, right? There's no part of the economy that's unaffected by that kind of thing. So anyways, I know that's a random topic, but it's been something that's been really interesting to see the public discourse of, oh, we have inflation, so we deserve a recession. No, if the Fed can pull off what they call a soft landing, whereas they trim inflation down to a level that's acceptable without triggering a recession, we should throw a parade, not wish for a recession. Like that. It's just, that seems very clear and level-headed economics to me, but you don't see a lot of that out there.
Similarly, so if inflation stabilizes, then cost of goods stay the same as they are now. If costs go down, does that mean we're in that recession?
No. So the term we're looking for there is disinflation. When there's an overall decrease in the price level in the economy, that's disinflation. What we worry about is if it gets full-fledged into deflation, where all prices in the economy are sliding down. We don't like that, because basically, if you think about when you're holding on to dollars in an inflationary world, you're literally seeing your dollars in your hand rot. You're like, oh man, they're getting less valuable every year. I either need to invest them or spend them. Well, from an economic point of view, that's great. You're either investing in your local economy or you are spending them in your local economy. Both great for economic growth. In deflation, you're looking at your dollars and you say, these things are going to be way more valuable in a year. I should hold on to them. And then everyone around you is like, yeah, I'm going to clutch on, like they're basically stuffing money under their mattress. And when you do that, less investment, less consumer spending. And so that you can trip yourself into a recession there. So that's where, you heard me in the talk earlier say like, hey, we're actually not wishing for a lot of disinflation. And that's why we don't want to see like a full-flown price plunge, because then there's this incentive to just hoard dollars, which is not what we want.
So this person joined a little bit late. Recap: why are groceries or commodity prices staying so increased just to catch them back up?
Yeah, you've had inflation rolling for 3 years. So when inflation goes up 5% in year one, and then it goes up 5% in the next year, which it actually went up like 9 or 10%, they stack on top of each other. So year after year, it's not that inflation just went up by 5% in this year. It's that it's stacked up across 3 years. So that's why grocery prices are high. The disappointing news is that they will remain at this level. We will no longer call this high. We will call this normal.
You talked about TVs and the example of you and your wife having the same TV for 10 years. So what should people buy on Black Friday? Is there certain goods that you think are better now with the economy that maybe a men's suit?
I mean, but that's the thing is like, and this is where I think it's kind of funny to point out, you're not shopping with inflation dollars, you're shopping with dollars. So it really is what your budget allows and affords. But yeah, the biggest like bang for your bucks that I've seen, and this is more personal opinion than true economics, is that like consumer electronics, just the real prices of consumer electronics have just plummeted over the years as we've gotten more efficient at making them. So to the example of men's suits being down, I think what was it, 5%? I need to have my slides pulled up, but that means the prices compared to last year are down 5%. And like, is that really going to tempt you to go spend hundreds of dollars on a suit? I don't know. I mean, it's not for me, but it may be for somebody. That's a small price decrease. So that's when as an economist, when I say optimize, what I mean is like, here's your budget. How do you get the max amount of happiness from your shopping? Once you factored in, all the bills, groceries, all that kind of stuff, how do you optimize? And so, for me, I'm not going shopping trying to avoid inflation. I'm going shopping trying to get the best bang for my buck. And so this actually has nothing to do with economics. I know like New York Times Wirecutter does a Black Friday review. I know other companies and news organizations do Black Friday reviews. But yeah, I would encourage folks to look at those, but also notice that like, you're going to be tempted to look at percent changes. But if you're looking at a $12 blender and they're like, it's 25% off, what a deal. Keep in mind, we're talking a couple of dollars. So when it's a higher ticket item that's hundreds of dollars, right? Think about the actual dollar savings based on budget, not just percentages. Because Amazon's really good at this. They're like, hey, this is 10% off. And you're like, well, yeah, it's $5. Like, congrats. That's not really that helpful, right? So just be aware percentage points don't matter as much when you're thinking about these goods.
So reading between the lines, Deanne, who asked that question, you can buy me a nice Pinot Grigio, Sauvignon Blanc. So is it fair to ask for a raise strictly because of inflation?
Well, that's an F word I never say in class. Fair is not an economist game. I'm not trained as an ethicist. That's not what I do. I point out that there's a lot of dueling points of what fairness is. Sometimes non-equitable distributions are deemed as fair, and sometimes equitable distributions. So I know we don't want to do that right now. You're like, oh gosh, too much philosophy. So is it fair? I don't know. Is it economically valid? Absolutely. Right? You're being paid for the marginal return on your labor, and I would assume that your employer is charging more for things right now. So why wouldn't you be paid more? But it's also, like I said, it's a complete mindset we have to change. And I don't say this with any happiness because as an economist, I'm really torn. Like, I look at my budget and I'm like, what is happening? But then I also know that if everybody goes and gets a raise at the same point, that's called wage spiral inflation. Basically, when everybody's having to pay more money for labor, it goes into the products that we buy, which causes more inflation to tick up. And so one concern we had as economists is that as inflation gets measured over this fall, which is the end of the fiscal year for a lot of corporate companies, are we going to see some of that tick up? Hopefully not. But I know if I sound like mealy-mouthed here, it's because I am. It's like I look at my personal budget and I'm like, good grief. Like, I need to, like, my personal finances need to be accounted for inflation. But it's like if everybody goes and asks for a raise, then yeah, you'll see a little more inflation. So this is the pernicious part about inflation, is that it affects everything. But I want to talk really, derogatory about inflation, but I always want to come back to the fact that it was done for the sake of, propping up the American economy. Greg, I'm going to have to find another spot to camp out in, so I'm going to turn my video off real quick. But
what? You're good. I'll let you go. We don't have any more questions coming through. So at this point, I'll thank you for your time because I know you're busy. Go have a good rest of the conference, and we'll catch up soon.
Well, sorry, and I didn't mean to, okay, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So if there is like one more, I could probably take one more if there was another question from someone.
The only other one we have is that phenomenon happening with all strikes? And I'm not sure what exactly that's leading to, but you know what?
Yeah. So part of that is the fact, why are so many of these strikes happening? Well, so let's take the SAG strike off the books. That's because of streaming. They can't figure out how to compensate in the face of streaming. Completely different animal. But the other ones, absolutely. It's people are like, I can't make it happen anymore at this wage level.
Awesome. Dr. Meadows, thanks so much for taking time out of your conference and your day for being with us and spending close to an hour with us.
No, happy to. Go Blazers, and hope everybody has a good afternoon.
Go Blazers. Thanks so much. And a quick reminder to everybody, we will be uploading a replay of this webinar onto our website today or tomorrow. Live attendees will receive an email tomorrow. Now, in a moment, I'm going to highlight a few upcoming webinars. But first, we'd love for you to join us this December for a couple of in-person events. On Saturday, December 2nd, it's in a new date, time. We're welcoming Santa Claus and Blaze together for the first time ever for Blazer Claus. Families can join the fun for only $35. Each ticket includes pictures with Santa and Blaze, games, decorating, all of this fun stuff. Then on Tuesday, December 5th, Blazer Bingo returns to the Alumni House. Tickets are $25 and include your bingo board, which contains 10 games of 6, a dauber, and food. We'll also have a cash bar on that evening. Register for all of these at alumni.uab.edu/events. That first week of December is a busy one for us in Alumni. We're also hosting the final webinar of 2023. Come back we're going to have the happiest Christmas with Gareth Jones on Thursday, December 7th, as we discover what makes National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation a cult classic. Join us in the new year as we host A Cup of Ambition, lessons learned from starting a small business on Thursday, January 11th. We will be talking with Jill Marler and her husband, James Little, about the truths of getting a small business off the ground. Then on Thursday, January 18th, Emily Davidson from UAB Employee Wellness will be here for Eating Well on a Budget, wallet-friendly strategies for nutritious meals. Learn how we can save money while enjoying good food. And on Monday, February 12th, we'll welcome Dr. Lizzie Davis back for The Science of Chocolate, Melting the History and Science. Explore the history and science behind this delightfully delectable food as our Science of series returns. Find out more about these and register for these and many others at alumni.uab.edu/events. Finally, let us know how we're doing. What would you like to see? Did you enjoy today's topic? The QR code on your screen is going to take you to a very brief survey. Share your thoughts as we continue to offer virtual presentations like today's webinar. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, go Blazers.